Today is in Hebrews chapter 11. Movie was released fairly recently about an aircraft pilot who came to be known as Sully. Captain Sullenberger very carefully and I think with a great amount of courage and fear led an aircraft that was in danger of crashing into a quote-unquote soft landing in a river in the middle of a city. There was damage, there were injuries, but the toll would have been far, far worse had he instead landed in the city itself. And so Captain Sullenberger, or Sully as we came to know him, became a hero for those whose lives he had saved, for those who admired the way in which he had kept his cool when so many others, during and even in the aftermath of the crash, lost theirs. We each in our lives have had heroes. And when we think about heroes, I saw something written by an educator this last week named Peter Gibbon, who, speaking to a conference of teachers, said, "In difficult times we turn to the word hero to express our deepest sorrow, our highest aspiration, and our profound admiration." Because when we think of our heroes in our lives, here in the story of a hero, not all is good news. Sometimes there's a threat of tragedy from which that hero emerges. We think of the planes crashing into the World Trade Center in 2001. The numerous heroes that emerged from that. People helping people. Firefighters. Policemen, chaplains, paramedics, a good number of whom died themselves while they were in the middle of or just after they had rescued others. But they became our heroes because they showed us what we as people are capable of doing in a time of great stress. They're showing that it is possible for a man or for a woman, when everything is falling down around them, to step forward and begin to make a coherent situation out of the turmoil. They showed us the meaning of courage. And when we read Hebrews chapter 11, we read about a collection of heroes, men and women, who, when God or His people needed them to step forward in faith, with courage, did so. And as I was reflecting this week on this lesson, the thought crossed my mind that in some lessons I've heard in the past on this, we sometimes sort of skim over the women in this passage. But there are several heroines of faith that are mentioned in these verses as well. And we're going to notice two of them especially this morning. And I suspect in all of our lives, we individually, and I want you to think about this as we go through the lesson, about who is my hero, who is your hero, who are the heroes in our lives. The people whom we have witnessed who stirred our imagination, who showed us what we could be, and who perhaps helped mold us into who we are today. Because we need more heroes. We need times when we are afraid. We need in times in which we are afraid to have an assurance that someone will be there to rescue the day. Wrapped up in being a hero is faith. We've been talking a lot this year about renewing hope. And hope is a concept that's very, very closely related to hope. Hope and faith are closely related. But faith is the assurance of things that are hoped for. It is the conviction of things not seen, says Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Faith does not transform our imagination into reality. It maintains our hope in what is real, even when our hopes may seem impossible. When our faith is rooted in God and in His reality and His creation, then we can hope, we can dream, and we can have an assurance that our faith is not merely mania, but is in fact something that will carry us through the darkest times. In the Bible, we read about great heroes of faith. We read about, in Hebrews 11, about Abel, who even though he was dead, still his faith spoke about his faithfulness in doing what God has said in His worship. We read in Hebrews chapter 11 about, by faith, Noah. Noah stepped forward, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen. In reverent fear, he constructed an ark for the saving of his household. And by this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. Noah perhaps had never heard of torrential downpour of rain. He had never witnessed such. Not know what the flood was, but God said, build an ark, build this boat, and he built it. And while he built, he took breaks to preach, to try to get people to come along with him, that they might be rescued from the deluge that was approaching. Before Moses had been a man named Enoch, who in a time of great wickedness had been a man of great faith in God, who had walked closely with God, whose faith had been so great that as we read the pages of the Bible, he seems to be one of two who never died. He walked with God, and he was not because God took him. He went with God. Like Elijah, who later would go into heavens in a whirlwind. Enoch's great faith was rewarded. Before he was taken, though, he was commended as having pleased God. Faith is essential for pleasing God. Because we don't have faith, we're not going to act. We're not going to respond to God's prompting, to God's invitation, to God's command. Without faith it is impossible to please Him. Verse 6 says, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that He exists, and that He rewards those who seek Him. Enoch teaches us that faith occurs in our minds, but it drives our bodies into action. And this is a truth that we see evidenced in each of these heroes. They had to believe before they could act. They acted because they believed, even though often those around them did not, and stood stymied by their lack of faith. Then there was Abraham. Faith sometimes is like an adventure, because God calls us through His Word to do something, or we have arise in our mind based on our understanding of God's will, a dream. And this dream may supersede, may be greater than anything that we've ever done. We may not be sure we can do it. And for those of us who have deployed, there may be a bit of fear about we don't know where we are going. We don't know if we will come back. When God called Abraham, He called him to go to a place Abraham had never seen. And He took him on a detour to get there. He made promises to Abraham. And one of those promises took many years to fulfill. Decades. It was an adventure. And Abraham sometimes struggled as he walked along in the midst of that adventure. Just as we struggle sometimes. When our faith seems to not quite be up to the task. But Abraham persevered, he endured, and he overcame, because, as verse 10 says, he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Abraham did not live in a structure, in a brick structure or a wooden structure. He lived in tents. But he was looking to a city that had foundations, whose designer and builder is God. He was looking ahead even as we should. By faith, Sarah, Abraham's wife. God had made Abraham a promise that he was going to have a son through whose descendants God would bless the entire world. And that Sarah would be the mother of that child. Years came, years passed. Decades came, decades passed. And when Sarah was in her 80s, she began to wonder about that promise. And she believed God. She believed God would keep that promise, but she wasn't quite sure she was the one that God was going to use. So Sarah encouraged Abraham to take a shortcut. That wasn't God's plan. But ultimately, in a way that still staggers our imagination, God kept His promise to Abram and Sarai, to Abraham and Sarah as we know them now. Yes, Sarah at times struggled to believe this promise. And once, even when it was just about to be fulfilled, she even laughed. There are people in the Bible who God told through His messenger, a parent, that they should name their child such and such. because that name had meaning and significance. And Abraham and Sarah's son was one of those people. He was named Isaac after they told Sarah and Abraham to name their son Isaac after Sarah laughed. Isaac means laughter. He would be a reminder that God does keep His promises. That we can rejoice because God does keep His promises. But Sarah believed, and if Sarah had not believed, what would have happened? That was a great promise. Through your son, through your seed, I will bless all the nations of the earth, God had told Abraham. And Isaac was clearly the son through whom that promise would come. And then one day, Abraham received a message from God that just must have made him stagger. Have you ever encountered a situation where, for whatever reason, it just seemed like it was impossible for you to do the right thing? For you to do what God commanded you because you didn't understand what God was commanding? Or because somehow it just seemed wrong? Abraham received a command to sacrifice his son. In verse 17 it says, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Verse 19 it says that Abraham considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back, because once Abraham demonstrated that he had the great faith to obey, God relieved him of the pain that he would have suffered. He did not require him to kill his son. But Abraham's potential sacrifice of Isaac places into clear relief God's own sacrifice of His Son on our behalf. But there are times that it seems that it's hard for us to obey. We have other calls for our allegiance. Our families, our children, our parents, our nation that may distract us from doing what God wants us to do. Abraham shows us that we can move forward in those moments. Because sometimes we do let things get in our way. The story was told by Robert Schuller, among many others, about a man who was walking out by a pond and he noticed another man fishing, and with some success. And he noticed this man that each time he caught a fish, and Jeff, you would appreciate this, each time he caught a fish, he measured the fish. And every fish that was under 10 inches long, he kept. And every fish that was over 10 inches long, he threw back in. And this greatly confused the man who was walking by the side of the pond. So he stopped and he asked, why are you throwing back the big ones? They seem like that would be the ones you would want to keep. Have your picture made with. The man still looked at him with a look of scorn and said, no, you don't understand. My frying pan's only 10 inches wide. Sometimes in our lives we don't put on blinders, but sometimes it's like walls have closed in and we only see it very narrowly forward. We only see one way forward. And we only see behind us. And we know where we've been. We know every failure we've ever had. And looking forward, it's hard to anticipate successes that will be greater than that. So we let circumstances limit our faith and our belief in what God can achieve. We have our own little frying pans into which we pour our faith. Our presuppositions, our constraints that we impose on ourselves that keep us from really doing everything that we can with God's power. Abraham, though, remember, had, when faced with this tremendous temptation, this tremendous test, to disobey God, to do something he found abhorrent, he considered that God was able to raise from the dead. One of their descendants was named Joseph. Joseph, of course, had been sold into slavery by his brothers in Egypt. He had come back. He had rescued his brothers and the rest of the people, the descendants of Israel, of Jacob. But as Joseph was dying, at the end of his life, as a leader of the people of the Egyptians as well as the Israelites, it looked as if God's promise to Abraham that he would make Palestine their promised land was just not going to happen that way. Because they were doing quite well in Egypt at that point. But Joseph, as he died, they mentioned that someday our people are going to leave this land. We're going to go back to Canaan. And I want you to take my bones with you when you go. And sure enough, several hundred years later, when they went back, the Bible tells us that they took the bones of Joseph with them and buried them where he had instructed. Moses had it made. He was raised by Pharaoh. He lived in the palace, had the best education, the best food, best clothing, and he gave it all up to lead a ragtag group of former slaves into the desert where they would complain and grumble and question his leadership skills for 40 years until finally he brought them to the promised land. But Moses persevered. And it's interesting wording here in verse 26, because more than 1,000 years before the coming of Christ, he considered reproach for Christ, greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Moses had faith. Verses 32 through 38 were read to us earlier, and they tell us about great heroes of faith. David we know, and we talk a lot about David. We don't talk as much about Rahab, the prostitute who rescued the spies when they were near capture in Jericho. We don't think so much about Barak or Gideon or Jephthah. But these are all mentioned here as great heroes of faith who, along with prophets of God who were flogged and chained and killed because of what they did in God's service. Hebrews 11 says, of whom the world was not worthy. Their faith set the standard. And sometimes it's people like these people in verses 32 through 38 that we need to look to the most strongly. Because we might find it easier to identify with some of them. because some of them had glaring weaknesses. They had failed at times in their service for God, but they had come through faith. And the ironic thing is that all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised. Since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. In other words, these great heroes of faith in the Old Testament don't really begin to get their reward until Christ comes. Till Christ redeems not only us, not only the people of the New Testament times, but those who had lived before Him. It is through Him that all are made clean. Great heroes of faith who in times of temptation, in times of testing, in times when it seemed that they had to do the unthinkable, found the courage, the belief in God to do what God asked. To step forward and do the task, whether it was a great task like Abraham having to move hundreds of miles away to a place he had never seen, or something more menial, like Rahab's giving a place to stay that was safe from the authorities in her town to 2 foreign spies who were there looking out for God's people. Who are your heroes? Sometimes our heroes are the people like the first responder who, strapped into a rope, reaches out into a surging current to pull someone out from certain drowning. Sometimes, and I think Jeremy, Clint, Rick, and others can appreciate this. Sometimes our heroes, when we were children, were the men whose hands we reached up and grasped, or the woman who picked us up and carried us across the street. The woman who herself had the faith. The man who had the courage to take care of those who couldn't take care of themselves just yet. Who are your heroes? As we go into Election Day on Tuesday, we're thinking about our nation. What kind of heroes do we need now? Not only on the national scene, but here on the local scene and in the congregation. What kind of heroes of faith do we need now? Who will step up and do the right thing for God, who will say with love and compassion, but with courage and truth, what needs to be said at the moment when it needs to be said. And finally, the question, are you that hero? Am I that hero whom God has called for this hour? This morning, look inside and ask yourself about your faith in God and how you are living for Him, how you are responding to the tests that you encounter, the temptations that you face. Are you God's man? Are you God's woman for this hour? Are you the hero that we need? Are you the hero that your neighbors need? Who's going to show the way to truth and to life? If you need to obey the Lord this morning by saying, yes, Lord, I believe, I'm going to turn away from sin, I'm going to be baptized today, then do it now today. If you need to say, Lord, as your servant, I like Sarah sometimes have laughed. I sometimes, like Moses, have gotten angry and doubted. Give me the courage like them, though, to persevere, get back on the track and surge ahead. We need heroes. Will you be one of them? Please, come now while we stand and we sing.